Hi, my name is Ron Vellen. Welcome to this video tutorial. This video is part one of a discussion on integrative negotiation. Here in part one, we're going to start by looking at an overview of the integrative process. We're going to learn how to recognize integrative situations. And we're going to look at some of the key steps, or let's call them facets, of an integrative negotiation. And along the way, one of the things you're going to see come up over and over again is how we're trying to understand interests and how to maximize the final agreement in combination with the relationship between ourselves and our opponent or opponents. Throughout the whole discussion, whether it's part one or part two, it's always going to come back to that. This combination of getting the best agreement for ourselves and putting the relationship into the equation in a very significant way. So we manage both sides and integrate them together to hopefully have not only a great agreement for ourselves, to make it truly win-win as well for the other party also, and to ensure we have a good long-term relationship and productive relationship with people we often will see as opponents. So the first thing we're going to do is have a look at an overview of what integrative negotiation is all about. So what is the integrative negotiation process? First and foremost, we need to think about creating a free flow of information. And why do we do this? Because we're trying to build more than just a transactional, momentary connection with someone. We're probably looking to build a longer-term relationship or continue a relationship along with getting the best possible deal out of it. So creating a free flow of information, that's not just us giving information, that's also getting good information from our opponent. So there's an exchange. We want to make sure that we attempt to understand the other person's real needs and objectives. We're going to talk about interests a little bit later. But what are they? In other words, it's much more than simply asking for their position. What are the issues that are being negotiated and what are their targets? You really want to understand what's driving them, what are their underlying needs? And this we find out, again, when we talk about interests. This is a lot of what we find out in the negotiation process this way. It's important to emphasize the commonalities between the parties and minimize the differences. And what does this mean? Well, we'll get into it a little bit later, but essentially what we're trying to do is close the gaps and bring parties together. And it's not necessarily about upfront compromise and rushing through it and just splitting things down the middle. This is about understanding. And this is a word we're going to come back to over and over again. Understanding each other and ensuring that you are also understood. And so this exchange of information, looking for commonalities and slowly reducing the differences, especially differences in perception, go a long way to developing and creating great, mutually satisfying agreements. And ultimately, we want to be able to search for solutions that meet the needs of both sides. We can create a little Venn diagram here just to give a sense of what we're talking about. Both sides have their own accountabilities, their own perceptions of things. In reality, there's often a lot more in common than we realize. And our job as negotiators, regardless of who the opponent is to see, can we expand this part? The part that is the common ground. And it's not just about saying, well, what do you want? And here's what we want. It's really about understanding each other. So I know this sounds a little repetitive, but I cannot emphasize this enough. It's about understanding, understanding, understanding. So how do we recognize when a negotiation is integrative? And remember, by integrative, we're talking about something that is win-win. It involves satisfying mutual interests and needs, sometimes referred to as mutual gains. It doesn't mean you have the same gains or you meet the same needs and interests. It's instead about finding ways to help each other attain the goals and meet the needs of the other one. So how do we recognize an integrative situation and differentiate it from a distributive situation? Well, there's some key things to look for. First thing is there more than one issue at stake? So it's not just price, it's not just quantity. Usually it's either more than one issue or the issue is more complex and it might have subcomponents. So again, multiple or one plus subcomponents. Does the situation invite the possibility of adding more issues to the mix? This is not about making it more complicated. This is about inviting ways to possibly expand the pie. So let's take an example. Let's say you're selling paper bags to a grocery chain. And these are great compostable paper bags that everyone loves because they're not plastic and they do a lot of great things. And your company manufactures more than just the paper bags. And the grocery store right now is only interested in the paper bags. But maybe the grocery store, when they're trying to negotiate with you on price, that they start talking to you about some of their storage problems, about where to put the bags. And you say, you know what, we have ways of doing what we call just-in-time delivery. We could actually deliver these bags to you more frequently so you wouldn't have to store as many. Now you're adding a delivery component as an issue. And maybe the grocery store also talks about some other things around helping customers carry out their groceries, and you're able to add more things into the conversation that may or may not cost the grocery store any more money, but now starts to expand the bargaining mix, the issues that are coming into the negotiation conversation. Without it, you're dealing with a fairly simple transaction. Sell bags and get out of there. But selling paper bags to a grocery store typically involves a longer-term relationship because you want to keep selling bags and other things to the store. So again, we come back to this idea of a relationship when we think about the negotiation is likely to recur over time. That means to come up again. So you may negotiate one particular aspect of a deal now with maybe several issues at stake and you work out a great agreement, and you're going to have to revisit it eventually because there's an ongoing working relationship. You see this a lot in business-to-business transactions, whether it's products or services. You see this a lot with consulting firms, legal firms, accounting firms. This is where their bread and butter is getting those big ticket clients to keep buying their services. And so if the negotiation is going to keep renewing itself, not because the first negotiation didn't work out, it's just that there's more demand and more request for services as things go on. So there's new negotiations. The parties have varying preferences across the issues, meaning they see things a little differently for every issue. They have different needs. In other words, the issues are not necessarily the same priority. So in the end, if you're doing something simple, like negotiating somebody, let's say a small grocer, over $50 worth of groceries, you know, you're buying those groceries and you're just trying to work out a price and you're leaving and that's it. That might be just a one transaction event. The grocer wants a certain price so they can make a profit. You want a lower price so you can save some money. The whole thing is really about the price of the groceries. There's the same level of importance on that price, more or less. But if you have varying preferences across several issues, then it gets more complicated and invites kind of a trade-off through understanding experience, meaning that if you understand that if there's 4 or 5 or 6 issues that you're working on with your opponent, if they think the third issue is the most important for them and you think the first issue is the most important for you, maybe there's a way to trade things off and have that conversation, say, look, I'm willing to help you out with number 3 if you help me out with number 1, and you go through this whole expansive kind of dialogue. So those are the main ways of recognizing an integrative situation. And it doesn't have to have all 4. It might just have 1 or 2. And you'll get to know it. My personal philosophy is I look at every encounter as potentially integrative, just out of habit. I'm not saying we're going to have an integrative conversation, but I find even the smallest transactions, I always think about what is the person's interest in what we're talking about? What's the relationship opportunity here? just as knee-jerk. It doesn't mean that we won't just have a quick transaction and compromise it. Just my whole mindset is around it, just based on my own experience of doing negotiations that sometimes lasted a year or two. Now we're going to dive into what the book calls the key steps in the integrative process. Not to get technical or too specific about language here, it's not exactly a step-by-step layout, even though that's the language the book uses. Think of it of the core elements that go into the negotiation process in an integrative way. And that way it'll be easier for you to track this and not look at it as it's kind of a sequential thing, because it really isn't completely sequential the way it's laid out here. There is something called the Pareto efficiency. Now, why is this term important? The Pareto efficiency relates to a diagram, which we're going to have a closer look at in a moment. And what this is about is this balance or integration of what's called creating value and claiming value. Creating value is all about the parties who have conflicting but compatible interests in an integrative situation, trading low priority issues for higher priority issues. So this is what I was referring to earlier, which is if you have a list of issues that you're working on, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever the number is, that list of priorities won't be the same likely for both parties or all the parties involved if it's a multiple party negotiation. The number one issue on the list might be critically important to you. It might be the fourth most important for your opponent. So this is where, through understanding interests, motivations, and needs through that dialogue, that you find out what those priorities are, and then you can trade things off in a way that allows people to get more of what they really want out of the negotiation without really sacrificing as much. This, in my opinion, is the majority of the time in the integrative negotiation process, is really creating that value. But equally important, even though it can often take less time, is something called claiming value. And claiming value is the part of the negotiation that requires us to clarify and make sure you carve out the best deal for yourself. So while you're doing all this creating value piece, you also want to make sure you keep your eyes on the prize and focus on carving out your share of the finite resources that are being negotiated. Because as creative as you are in the creating value process, you're going to hit a limit. And that limit is whatever those finite resources are. You need to get your needs met. So these two things are like two awarenesses and two forces at play that you need to pay attention to. How do we create value? Sometimes people call it expand the pie, which is you're really trying to build the availability of solutions and resources that are being discussed. And the claiming value piece, which is making sure you take out of that what you need out of the negotiation to have a good, strong, successful agreement. And the Pareto efficiency is simply saying there is a push-pull kind of a dynamic here that when both parties are doing this well, it becomes a naturally efficient way of maximizing value for both sides. So this is where it comes down to the diagram, which we're going to have a look at here. Here we have two axes. On this one, this is the axis of creating value to the buyer. Let's say the buyer and the seller, and these are opponents. This is the axis of creating value to the seller. And not all negotiations are buyer-seller, but of course these are quite common. And so you have these two pulling forces. Creating value happens when both parties are having that integrative conversation. And what you're doing is expanding this area here, creating a bigger pie that allows you to get a bigger part out of that pie. If you ever watch some of these reality shows where they have investors, things like Shark Tank or Dragon's Den or other things, sometimes the investors will say, wouldn't you rather have 10% of $10 million rather than 50% of $500,000? What they're saying is together we can create a much bigger organization or entity or business. Even if you have a smaller part of it, your 10% of a $10 million business is worth $1 million. But your 50% of a $500,000 business is only worth $250,000. So they try to paint a picture of this expanding pie. They're trying to mutually create value in that negotiation. The Pareto efficient frontier that this is referring to is this symbolic boundary that if you can expand it more and more this way, you have a better chance of reaching a more successful and more fulfilling and more valuable agreement with your opponent. Now, your opponent may not have the same motivation, may not have the same level of trust, and that's a gamble in every negotiation. But as you're going through all of this, it's really important to not lose sight of the need to claim value as well. And this is not something you have to do only at the end. You can kind of clarify as you go along if you're trading off different issues or target points that you're moving through things. As you're getting your needs met, you can kind of put that in your hip pocket and then move on to other things. So these things with complicated negotiations tend to be done bit by bit. So that's the Pareto efficiency. The next thing we're going to talk about is related to this, and that is the negotiator's dilemma. This is something that comes up when we're working with the creating value and claiming value ideas, these actions of expanding the pie and taking our share of that bigger pie. And that is that there is a tension, a natural tension, between the competitive and cooperative behaviors we utilize in a negotiation. It's said here that no matter how much creative problem solving enlarges the pie, it must still be divided. In other words, you might have a great creative conversation, but you have a job to do, and that is to make sure you get your needs met, and that means you have to take your part of that expanded pie. You can't just give it up. So the value that has been created must be claimed, and so this might invite some of that competitive approach, in which case you might, in more complex negotiations, actually utilize some elements of distributive bargaining, simply because there is a time where you have to say, okay, I need this, or I need this, or I need this. And so you can still do it in a very integrative context, but you have to claim value. It does not mean that you have to go whole hog distributive and use some of those hardball tactics. It does not. It just means you have to keep your eye on the prize and not lose sight of it. There are two other dilemmas that are worth mentioning here. One is the dilemma of trust, and the other is the dilemma of honesty. And it's important to keep those in mind because it could affect this dilemma between being integrative and collaborative and being more competitive and claiming value. The dilemma of trust is about how much I can trust my opponent and what they're telling me. The dilemma of honesty is how honest I'm going to be with what I share with my opponent based on how much I trust them. So I'm just going to note that here. Let's say this is me, and I'll use a different color here for my opponent, and this is the opponent. So the dilemma says, do I trust? It also asks, how honest will I be? And these are both from your perspective. So do I trust this person? And how honest will I be? In other words, what information will I share with my opponent? Well, that will depend on how much I trust them. It's sort of a two-way street that feels a lot one way sometimes, but it is really something that comes up around this negotiator's dilemma. Next, we're going to talk about interests, and this is the final topic for this part. Really important to understand interests. We've talked about these in other modules, and this particular chapter content gets into it more deeply, but really to understand what are interests in a negotiation. Interests are the underlying concerns, needs, desires, or fears that motivate a negotiator, and this is in relation to the issues. Now, you can have interests that are not connected to issues at all, and yet, in my experience, hidden within them are all of the interests, even if you can't connect the interests directly to those issues in the negotiation. So, what kind of interests are there? There are substantive interests, and these relate to key issues in the negotiation. So this is very clearly connected to the specific issues that are being negotiated. So if you're talking about price, delivery schedules, quality control, whatever those issues are that you're working out, The substantive interests are either your or your opponent's interests in the outcomes they want from those issues. Then we have process interests, and they're related to the way a dispute is settled. We don't go deep into this into our course, but what this is about is if you have a very complicated, long negotiation that may require several meetings over time, there may be some dialogue simply about how the negotiation is going to take place. Where are we meeting? How are we handling meals, breaks? Who's taking notes? How many people can be there? There's so many things that can go into working out your process interests. Relationship interests. The relationship interests are the ones that have to do with how we see or how valuable we feel the relationship is and can be. Do we want to maintain a good working relationship with the person? I mean, ideally, we probably do. Or do we see this as potential growth with this working relationship? And hopefully, if it's a business-to-business relationship, you have the opportunity for more revenue down the road. And so these relationship interests come up a lot, especially in an integrative negotiation with your substantive interests. And then we have the interests in principle. These are the principles that are held by each party that provide kind of the dominant guide to their actions. So it's how people see things like fairness, right action, what is acceptable, what is ethical. We talk a lot about things like values, motives, all this kind of stuff. We don't get into that in this course too much because our simulations don't really allow for it. We don't really have the time, but the interests in principle really are about understanding ourselves and trying to understand our opponent and what motivates them. In short negotiations, it's not necessarily as important, but in long ones, especially if the relationship interests are very, very big or very high, the interests in principle may be a factor that need to be fleshed out as well. So a few more things about interests. There is almost always more than one type of interest underlying a negotiation, and I would say even likely underlying each issue. What this means is that you can count on the fact that only having one specific interest during a negotiation is highly unlikely. We're just more complicated as human beings than that. Each of the parties can have several different types of interests at stake. We've already covered that. And so keep that in mind, that when you're negotiating with somebody, they may provide clues to you as to what some of these interests are. And we have to be careful not to make assumptions. We're going to do it anyway, but be mindful that you may or may not be right about what's really motivating somebody. They may tell you, and they may be even lying to themselves. I've seen that happen over and over again. Interests can change over time. I have witnessed this often. When you have a longer negotiation, it's unlikely it's going to change very much over an hour or two. But in situations where I've worked in long professional negotiations that take months, sometimes a couple of years, interests do change. It doesn't mean that the person wasn't honest or wasn't communicating things, or our interests hadn't changed, or our interests were wrong at the beginning. It's just that things evolve, things become clearer, our circumstances change, who are accountable may make different decisions behind the scenes. Whoever the indirect actors are in our world, remember that's the kind of third level of accountability and stakeholder. Those kinds of folks, maybe you get a new boss and their things change. I've had that happen to me where, I have one boss and then a year later there's a negotiation ongoing. A new boss comes in, has a different opinion on how it should go. And those interests can change there. There's so many different ways they can change. And there are many, many ways to surface these interests. You can uncover interests in your opponent by simply asking questions and listening. You can uncover interests by observing how they behave. There's an old expression that says people vote with their feet. What it is about is that people can say anything they want, but their behavior will tell you what's really important to them. In a negotiation, most people are trying to do a good job to get a great deal and so on. And, I think most people aren't outright liars all the time. But if you observe people's actions and how they emphasize things, where are they putting more energy and where are they expressing more concern around which issues, That's where you're going to find out more about what their interests are. If they're not going to tell you directly, then what they're probably going to be doing is telling you through their actions what some of their interests might be. And so observe this. If you ask questions directly, they may or may not tell you. And the better you know someone, the greater likelihood they might tell you, depending on how the relationship is going. But this is something that you can do through observing behavior, asking questions, intuition, other observations with maybe they have other people with them. How are they talking to each other? What's their body language like? Lots of these communication tools will tell us. These last 2 points I won't spend a lot of time on, but there is something here that's worth noting, and that is that it's not always helpful to know about your opponent's interests. And so why is this the case? Well, certainly in a team situation, it can break up a team's unity. And why would this happen? If you're negotiating with your own team and your opponent is a team as well, they'll be presenting a unified front. In other words, their position initially, which is perhaps their opening offer or counter offers and so on, that's the position they're taking. If you start to get into different people's interests, it may actually break apart the unity, or it may unduly influence how you see where the negotiation is going. The same thing with your own team. Once you guys flesh out what you want to do, you need to unify and clarify the team's interests as a whole entity. Once you start really probing, you may find that that unity falls apart or works against you, because now you're trying to figure out what's really important. One person might say one thing's important, one person might say something else is important. You may misread or misinterpret the emphasis you need to put on one of the people's interests when in fact it might not matter at all. It does complicate matters. My experience has been that I have not yet been thrown by somebody expressing their interests in all my years of working in either simple or very complex negotiations. Sometimes what happens is if you're inviting interests, and this has happened in rare circumstances, it might invite the opponent thinking that you have more to give than you do. In other words, if you pay attention to an interest that they share with you, they may not have ever thought of turning that into an issue or something that they want to get out of the negotiation, but now you're showing concern or you're paying attention to that interest. That might actually complicate the negotiation beyond what it needs to be. So it's the kind of thing that it's a small caution, but I wouldn't avoid it just because it might make things more difficult. In my experience, it's far more important to understand the interests of not only yourself, but also your opponent to get a much better deal and really expand that pie using the Pareto efficiency. So that's it for part 1. In part 2, we're going to get into the specific strategies and tactics of integrative negotiation.